Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. This is Words and Numbers, brought to you by the Center for American Culture and Ideas.
Woot!
We have a new home.
How about that?
How about that is right. You'll be hearing more about the Center for American Culture and Ideas, commonly known as CACI to those of us in the business, in the weeks and months to come.
Excellent.
So, what's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
Well, what jumped out at me could almost qualify as a foolishness, and that is California is raising its minimum wage. Let me back up a minute. It's not raising its minimum wage. It's raising the minimum wage on fast food restaurants that have more than 65 locations throughout the country. So basically, it's McDonald's, Burger King, these things.
And how much are they raising the minimum wage to?
To $20 an hour.
Well, that's way better than the fight for 15.
Let that sink in. Full-time at $20 an hour.
It's over $40,000 a year.
Almost $42,000 a year.
Yep.
That's astounding. It's not the median. Well, it may be approaching the median individual income. And so I'm thinking about this, and I thought, well, hang on a second. The cost of living in California is higher. Maybe that comes into account. And it turns out the cost of living in California is about 34% higher than it is nationwide as a whole. But here's the thing. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If you increase that by 35%, you're not even at $10 an hour. So basically, even adjusting for cost of living, California's minimum wage is more than double what the federal minimum wage is.
And I'm going to ask right now what I ask every single time something like this comes up. What could possibly go wrong?
Glad you asked, because I'm looking at their unemployment numbers. The unemployment rate in California is currently around 4.6%.
Boy, that's kind of high.
Versus nationally around 3.6%. And I put a footnote here. The numbers here are delayed, so these are numbers from July. 4.6% California, 3.6% national. And you look at those two things, you say, well, that's not that different. It's just 1 percentage point off. Except 1 percentage point at that level is the equivalent of about a 30% difference in joblessness. 30% difference in joblessness.
Ouch.
So what's going to happen? What's going to happen anytime you raise the minimum wage? You're going to get unemployment. You'll have a few people who remain employed at the McDonald's and the Burger Kings and this and that, making the $20 an hour, and that's quite good. But a lot of the people who used to work there aren't going to work there anymore because they're going to be replaced by machines because a business has got to make money. And if you force it to pay people more, it's going to look around and ask who's worth more, and those who aren't worth more, it's going to get rid of.
Something else is going to happen.
Well, lots of things are going to happen. What do you have in mind?
And fast food prices are going to go up.
Well, maybe not, because this increase to $20 an hour, first off, it only applies to fast food restaurants, and even then, only ones that have more than 65 locations nationwide. So little like mom and pop diners, not going to be affected. Even regional fast food places aren't going to be affected.
But here's the thing. These places are all mom and pop places. They're franchised.
Yeah, and that's the other weird thing, because you think about McDonald's or Burger King as this big corporation.
It's not.
No, McDonald's does not sell hamburgers. They sell advertising. The individual McDonald's outfits are individually owned shops.
That's right. It's franchised. McDonald's is a real estate business.
Yeah. And I didn't even tell you the best part. California is establishing a 9-person board.
Oh, boy.
To henceforth oversee this thing. And the board is charged with raising the minimum wage annually by the lesser of inflation and 3.5%.
Well, I know how compounding works. This is going to be a mess.
Right, exactly. So 10 years from now, when we do an episode asking the question, why is it there are no fast food restaurants in California, yet every other state has them? We'll refer listeners back to this episode.
That's right. And I just want to point out now that when we do that episode, the correct answer is going to be racism.
Yes, right.
I can guarantee you that that will be the answer 10 years hence.
Because it's never failed policy.
No, that's right. It's always racism. And I've said before, when everything is racism, nothing is. So congratulations, everyone. Anyway, I have a choice to give to you. And I know offering an economist a choice is probably not the smart move here in the real world.
We get fixated on the one we didn't pick.
Yeah, I know. The short answer is you're going to get them both. But do you want the foolishness of the week to come from, of all places, California or Chicago?
Well, we always get foolishness from California.
Chicago it is.
Okay.
Which brings me to California and a text I got from longtime listener and world-class supporter Wes Westmoreland, who said, James, this has to be the foolishness of the week, maybe the foolishness of the year. California is engaging in a lawsuit against oil companies because said companies deceived the public on the risks their businesses posed to the climate, and now California seeks damages or funds for storm damage.
Huh. Okay, so the oil companies deceived, and how did they deceive? By telling us what? That global warming wasn't a thing?
Apparently they didn't tell us that there would be storms.
Okay.
For more than 50 years, big oil has been lying to us, covering up the fact that they've long known how dangerous the fossil fuels they produce are for our planet, said Governor Newsom. California taxpayers shouldn't have to foot the bill for billions of dollars in damages. Wildfires wiping out entire communities, toxic smoke clogging our air, deadly heat waves, record-breaking droughts parching our wells.
Well, okay, now hang on a second.
Yeah, you saw the sleight of hand there, didn't you?
Well, this business about the wildfires, it causing billions of dollars of damage?
That's right.
Those wildfires were caused by California's environmental laws.
That's right.
That prevented controlled burning.
And which also reallocated scarce resources away from replacing old lines that are on old poles to doing all kinds of new environmentally friendly nonsense that costs a fortune.
Right.
And what happens during a storm? Old poles crack, lines come down, fires start.
I've seen this pattern repeatedly over the past 6 months of politicians at the state and the federal level using whatever it is, some group or corporations or whatever, as scapegoats, blaming them for things that the politicians themselves did.
As luck would have it, Ant, I have the perfect solution for big oil and big gas, which is also included. Stop selling your products in California for a week.
There we go. That's right. And you fast food restaurants, you could leave too.
Yep. Just close your doors. Not even forever. Do it for a month. Yeah, it would materially impact the bottom line.
Right.
But look what it might accomplish down the road. Look, if a state doesn't want you to do business in their borders, don't. People should get what they want, good and hard. Give it to them. And that really could have, and maybe even should have been, the foolishness of the week. But due to the Economist's choice, we move on to Chicago. That example of how to run a city in these United States, right? Can't we all take a lesson from how Chicago does business?
The one thing I know about Chicago that annoys me to no end is they have this high gun homicide rate, despite the fact that they have draconian gun laws.
Well, that's just because the laws aren't draconian enough yet.
Yes, or when you push them on that, they say it's because people are bringing guns in from other places that don't have draconian gun laws.
If only we could foresee these problems and have policy that conforms to them. Chicago is now proposing that they have city-run and city-owned grocery stores.
Oh, come on, because they have done such a good job at their city-owned and city-run schools, for example.
Well, that's not where I was going to go with this, although you're not wrong to go there. But if they're proposing that they should do this, that necessarily means that they don't have enough grocery stores. And if they don't have enough grocery stores, that necessarily means that grocery store companies, those organizations dedicated to running grocery stores professionally, can't make a profit in Chicago. Why can't they make a profit in Chicago? Because people keep stealing all the groceries.
Right.
Now, how is any of that going to be addressed by a city-run grocery store? That's just going to be a sinkhole down which everybody's dreams, hopes, aspirations, and money flow regularly.
Well, what the politicians will do is point to these grocery stores and how well they work because they have such low prices completely ignoring the fact that A, they may have low prices, but there's nothing on the shelves. B, the low prices are due to the fact that Chicago has very high taxes that they use to subsidize these city-run grocery stores.
And here's the thing. If thieving is the problem that has legitimate grocery store chains running for the hills, you can't make the prices low enough to stop that.
Yes, that's correct.
That is part of the local culture, and the only way to change that is to disallow it. Mm-hmm. And unless you're willing to disallow it, you're going to have the same problem over and over and over again. And these things are going to become money pits. They're going to be mismanaged. It's going to be like watching the state of Pennsylvania run liquor stores, right? The state of Pennsylvania is not in the liquor store business. It's in the government business, and it doesn't even do that well.
Right, and you'll get in Chicago what you have in Pennsylvania, which is the big winners from the state-run liquor stores in Pennsylvania are the union bosses, because those state-run shops are all unionized.
That's right. Every friend of every politician is going to be the big winner here.
Yep.
The big loser will be the taxpayer.
Yes.
Because that's always how it works. But I look forward to hearing how this is all the result of racism.
Right. And when it doesn't work, it's because they didn't do enough of it.
That's right. And what we really need to do is double down and maybe have some kind of anti-racism program facilitated by the government.
Government owned and operated.
It was a day of 3 foolishnesses of the week if you're keeping score at home. And I hope you are. But Ant, one last thing before we take leave of each other this week for the regular portion of the program. I'm really happy to be on board with Khaki. I think this is going to be a brave new world for Words and Numbers, and I hope for Khaki as well.
Yes. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. Bryan McCannon joins us this week. Bryan is the Robert S. Eckley Endowed Professor of Economics and Dean of the School of Business and Economics at Illinois Wesleyan University. Bryan is here to talk about his research involving masks in COVID deaths. But interestingly, I ran across this because Bryan was a dissertation advisor for both my daughter at WVU and her husband, my now son-in-law. We were talking about COVID deaths and masking, and I'm doing some research on my own of the ability of the CDC to forecast COVID deaths. And he said, oh yeah, my advisor, Bryan McCannon, did this interesting research, which I want to talk about the research unto itself, but then he also said you had a fascinating interaction with a series of journals in attempting to publish your research. So let's start with the research. What were you looking at and what did you find?
Thanks for having me on. I was interested in the face mask mandates as a policy to study. And first, let me explain big picture. This health pandemic was impactful, and that's an understatement. And policymakers were throwing out all sorts of ideas, right? All sorts of policies, many of them completely untested, untried. Maybe you can understand some of the motivation, right? We hadn't seen a health pandemic like this for 100 years, and we need to save lives. But some of the ideas were serious infringements on people's freedom. We're locking people in home, putting masks over their face. These are also, in my opinion, non-trivial interventions. And now we've had a few years since the pandemic has come along. And I think it's appropriate and responsible for researchers, now that we've had a few years and we can measure the impacts, and now we should be talking about the effectiveness of those policies that we had never tried before. And that was kind of my motivation for this. My research was specifically focused on the face mask mandates that were put in at the state level. It's just one of the many policies of the untested and the untried. And I really want to know how beneficial were these policies that had serious restrictions on people's movement and activities. And so that was kind of my overarching research interest, let's say. And this one, I was really interested in face mask mandates. What got me thinking about this project in particular was a friend of mine who's a co-author on the primary paper, found a little short 5-page article in a medical journal talking about a alternative theory, a biological theory about why face masks might not be so great for you. And that got me quite curious because the public conversation had been, if you think about intro to economics, right, a public goods problem is how I'd been viewing the face mask, right, is they might be uncomfortable, they might get your face puffy, that kind of stuff. So there's a private cost to be bore, but public benefit to reducing disease spread, then that's one of the times that mainstream economics says that maybe some intervention would be welfare improving, right? So that was my mentality beforehand until I came across this alternative argument that maybe there was some escalated costs that we should be paying attention to. So that was my motivation to get into the project.
One of the interesting things here is you're talking about this. I'm picturing people saying, well, this is just evil to even ask the question, because who cares if the masks work? As long as it saves one life, it's worth doing. So it causes you a bit of discomfort. So what? Again, if it saves one life. And so we shouldn't even ask the question you're asking.
Well, I believe in trade-offs,
right,
and non-infinite margin rate of substitution. There are costs and benefits to everything, and I think it's completely appropriate to ask about those costs and benefits, right? It's hard to think about the infinite marginal benefit.
You're considered a crazy person if you ask these questions.
Yeah, there's definitely social pressures. There's definitely a peer pressure effect. Do you want to be the person who's going against saving people's lives and not being popular?
Just for a second, though, if we could back up to where you started. Why is it you think that so few people are asking these questions? Why is this an irrelevant research item for almost everybody who should be very concerned with this sort of thing?
The nice thing about being tenured faculty member is you can ask unpopular questions.
Well, that's the whole idea of tenure once upon a time, right?
Yeah,
that you
right.
would be free to indulge yourself in these sorts of crazy things that might actually make human life better.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a responsibility to sometimes ask unpopular questions.
But very few people are asking anything approaching this very specific question. And you're right, we've got a few years now in the rear view, and we've got a lot of data, and we could really sink in. And when I wake up every morning, what do I see? I see a bunch of politicians telling me right now that I have to start wearing a mask again.
Yeah.
And I don't see any evidence leading to that conclusion. And yet they get a free pass for it.
As a matter of fact, I would even add to that. Obviously, when you work on a research paper, you also have to do a literature review and talk about what do we know beforehand. And for a policy like this, that made me go look through the medical research on what we knew about face masks in general. Obviously not for COVID, because we hadn't seen COVID before. But what do we know about face masks in other settings? There's a handful of meta-analysis, and they would all start with the opening line. We cannot find conclusive evidence of health benefits to face mask mandates. So that was known in the medical research journals back in 2020.
And if it was known then, it's known now. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
But again, someone who hears that and says, okay, we don't see any conclusive evidence that masks are beneficial, someone would say, okay, yes, but the only cost is some discomfort, so we should be safe and go ahead and use them anyway. Now, if I understand correctly, you found even stronger evidence that we shouldn't be wearing them.
Yeah, that's right. Two things on that. First, I just want to make sure it's perfectly clear that the research focuses on the policy of face mask mandates, not necessarily wearing a face mask. Those are slightly different differences. If I just stick to the data, I can't measure who is wearing a face mask, the quantity of people that are complying, violating policy. So that intensive margin of how many people are wearing is not measurable. I can look at when government steps in and tries to mandate this for public areas. So the big punchline of the research writers is not just that it's uncomfortable, but the face mask mandate policy contributed to the number of COVID-related deaths.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Can you explain that a bit? I want to hear all about that right there.
Yeah, sure. So first, James, to your question, so there might be some social pressures or unpopularity, but the other thing that holds back high quality research, right, is to have those kind of natural experiments where you can actually identify in the data this particular policy separated from all of the other policies that might be running around out there, so that you can identify that it is this policy that's causing it. And that is quite a task sometimes for some of these projects. And so the way I was able to pull this off was because of something unique that happened in the state of Kansas. And so my project only looks at the state of Kansas. And what made them so unique was that, in a nutshell, without going too much into the legislative history, before the state legislative body gave the governor the ability to have these kind of wide scope restrictions, they passed a law that said that if the governor of that state put in any health restriction that local county health officials felt was excessively harsh, then that county could opt out of the governor's statewide requirements. And I believe it's the only state that I know of that allowed local jurisdictions to refuse the governor's mandates. And so what we have in Kansas is this broad timeline. In early July of 2020, the governor of Kansas stepped in and said, we need to have a face mask mandate for anybody going to public places. But this law let individual counties opt out and still allow people to move freely without face masks. And so when the initial order went into effect, approximately 1/3 of the counties actually implemented, about 2/3 chose not to. Over the summer, some county boards changed their mind. So we have some staggering over the late summer. And then in November, we were talking about how we expect the spike to happen over the winter, especially the holidays, right? And we talked about that quite a bit. And so in November, the governor of Kansas reissued the statewide mandate, and a smaller subset of counties opted out the second time. So we have just a small group of counties jumping in July, little change over the summer, then a bigger group jumping in November. And some counties, quite a good chunk of them, never, I think about 40 of the counties in Kansas, never implemented a face mask mandate. So you have early adopters, late adopters, never adopters. And it's that geographic variation within the state. And all the other COVID policies will be symmetric across all of these. So shelter at home policies will be the same for all of these counties. Unemployment compensation changes and labor market conditions will be the same across the. And so we have a really unique experiment here in Kansas where only this face mask mandate policy varied over time across the state. And then you have a fighting chance of measuring its impact.
And what did you find?
The punchline result, if you want to put a number on it, is for the marginal effect is that for every 2 additional weeks of a face mask mandate at the county level, you end up causing 3 additional deaths.
For every 2-week mandate, you cause 3 additional deaths.
Yeah.
How could that possibly be?
Okay, that's more important. That's the punchline. So here's the problem. I have 2 stories and I cannot differentiate between them. So I'll give you them both, right? So one is a biological, one is a behavioral story. The biological one's going to have to be left for biologists to verify directly in laboratory settings. That's not me. But the biological theory, medical researcher by the last name of Fogen, F-O-E-G-E-N, he's a European researcher, basically made this argument that if you put a face mask over your mouth, if you're healthy, fine. But imagine you do get exposed to COVID, and now you have the virus in your system. You will be exhaling the virus. And that's the problem. That's why we want to keep 6 feet distances. We don't want to be indoors with other people and while we're in the face mask, because your exhale, the water droplets in your exhale will have the virus on it. But if you're wearing a mask, he argued, then those water droplets in the COVID virus are being caught by the mask. And what happens right after you exhale? You inhale. That's how we breathe. And so as you exhale the virus, you immediately re-inhale it. And so the biological argument is that you are increasing your viral load because you're not allowing the body to expel as much of the virus as it would otherwise if you didn't have the face mask on. And so that's essentially the biological argument, that we're just increasing viral loads so that conditional on being exposed to the virus, you're more likely to become symptomatic or more seriously symptomatic than you would otherwise if you weren't wearing the mask. The second theory is a behavioral one. And it's one that's been studied in economics for a long time. And it's called the offsetting behavior hypothesis, or some people call it the Peltzman effect. But it's a very straightforward idea. Whenever we put any kind of safety improvement on the world, think seatbelts. That's the famous first example that Sam Peltzman studied. But other applications would be all the safety equipment side automobiles. There's been research looking at child-proof caps on Tylenol. You even see people in infrastructure talk about how wide you make the road versus how narrow. Whenever you do any of these safety improvements, we also need to recognize that we're changing the cost-benefit calculation for somebody who's choosing how risky or how dangerous to live their life. And so if you're wearing a seatbelt, then if you get in an accident, it's not quite as bad. It's still bad, don't get me wrong, right? But it's not quite as bad. And so we should expect on the margin that if it's a little safer, then I will choose a little more risky activity than before. So you see this argument with concussions in the NFL. If we took helmets off these guys, they wouldn't go flying at each other like darts, because with the helmets, they think their head is more safe than if they didn't have the helmet on. So we see these kind of behavioral responses quite a bit. On heart medication or cholesterol medication, start eating more red meat, offset the health benefits that they're receiving. And so the behavioral response here is that if we have face masks and people code that as leaving the house is not as dangerous now as before, then we should suspect that people are going to leave the house more and go enjoy themselves under the thought that it's a little safer because other people are wearing these masks. So if you think it's safer, you show up to the bars, you show up to the restaurants more than before. You're around people with COVID, and we increase the chance that you get it. One way we show this effect is in the back end of the paper is we look at cell phone tracking data, which became very popular study the last couple of years. Some of the big cell phone tracking companies that used to be selling it only privately did share some of this data with the academic community so that we can study the disease. We looked at bars and restaurants in the state of Kansas, and we found that the number of cell phone pings, so like every 15 seconds, they're pinging your cell phone. The number of cell phones that were sitting at bars and restaurants increased when the county added face mask mandates.
Fascinating.
People left the home and then exposed themselves to more of the virus. So either theory, whichever one you want to argue, it's very tough to distinguish the two theories. We've tried, we can't come up with one. And if some future researcher can figure out how to differentiate the two, that'd be super awesome. But regardless of whether the biological theory or the behavioral theory is driving the results, we're seeing that when we have face mask mandates, disease transmission rate goes up, and consequently, with a lag of about 4 to 6 weeks, we see death rates rise.
And see, those two possible explanations that you're giving, to my mind, significantly change the national conversation. Because up until this point, you could kind of see the argument that, look, if the only cost is inconvenience and the benefit is possibly saving lives, why are we even discussing this?
Yeah.
But your two arguments now make that balance more symmetric, that it's not simply inconvenience. You could actually be losing lives on the other side. And now I could see reasonable people everywhere saying, okay, let's actually look at the data. This is no longer an emotional issue. It's now a factual issue.
Yeah, that's right. And behavioral economics, we talk about what motivations might people have. It doesn't rely on altruism, right? It doesn't rely on, well, I just care about other people.
Yeah.
These are likely direct harms to the people that are wearing the face masks.
So I want to get back to the question I've already asked. Given everything that you've just said as prologue, and it's really interesting prologue, why is everybody so uninterested? It's not a disinterest, it's an uninterest, right? It's even worse. And where is the natural curiosity of all of those people, say, in the press who love to talk about how we need to have mask mandates? Where's their natural curiosity when faced with alternate evidence, solid, interesting evidence? Take that whichever way you would like to take it.
I think we definitely not only just have social peer pressures, but it seems straightforward that we have some kind of social signaling going on. We were talking earlier about the cell phone tracking data. One of the best correlates with just movement during the pandemic at the regional level seems to be partisan divide, crudely measured as pro-Trump versus pro-Clinton voters in a particular area, is a fantastic way to forecast how much people will be sheltering at home versus not sheltering at home. There seems to be something, I don't know if ideology is the right word to use here, but there is a distinct difference in our society on how people reacted to the COVID pandemic, and specifically face mask wearing, sheltering at home, these types of things. And it's correlated with other divides we see in our society today.
Tell us what happened as you attempted to publish these results.
Yeah. So I'm also a little stubborn, but also it's another beauty of being tenured is I can get the paper rejected. It's not the end of the world. I can take that time and send it around. And as you know well, there's a ranking of journals, the best journals and lowest, and you get more exposure the higher up the food chain you are. So we shopped this paper around to a wide variety of places. We tried the hard sciences, some of the best journals there. We tried some of the best general interest economics. We tried specifically health economics, health policy journals. And then we started having to go down the food chain. And I think we ended up with 12 desk rejections right off the bat.
Explain to our audience what a desk rejection is.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm an economist, so I assume other fields work similarly to economics. But when you submit a research paper to a journal, the editorial team handles that review, that peer review process. And the first step is that the editors of the journal, some editors assigned to it, to take a read and to look over the paper. And they'll make it a relatively quick decision right off the bat to either reject the paper and say, we're not even going to have this thing peer reviewed. We're just throwing it away now. Or to send it to the peer review process. So it's like a screening step before you go through peer review, primarily because peer review takes a long time. You'll send it to numerous academics who should know what they're talking about. We'll take our sweet time reading it and giving comments back. That could take months and months and months. So the idea of this initial screen is if the editor's pretty sure he or she's not going to go forward with the paper, they can just get rid of the paper within a short time period. Journals differ in the proportion of papers they end up desk rejecting right off the bat. And the argument is usually that it's to get rid of the bad research. One thing about the desk rejection process is that many journal editors don't have to provide rationale. They could just dispose of the paper. But that still eats up time. Each desk rejection takes a few weeks to get done. And so that's what we had happen to us. When you go to the science journals that we tried, they say they use a scorecard to measure the potential impact of the research and value of it. And the desk rejections just simply said, we do not score it high enough to warrant consideration. They didn't view that studying this policy was worth their time reviewing. In economics journals, the editors usually try to provide some justification for the desk rejection. I'll just give you like one example. We sent it to a health econ journal. So one desk rejection said, well, you didn't put lagged values of the dependent variable on the right-hand side. For the readers who don't know econometrics, that's just kind of a time series approach where you say there's inertia in your data. So you want to control for the previous to see how it changes from next. That will take approximately 5 seconds to fix, right? I can rerun the regression with it on the right-hand side, no problem. And as a matter of fact, this paper, our supplemental appendix, which has no text, is just tables of additional results, is over 40 pages long. We ran every regression we could think of, trying to anticipate every criticism of econometrics. And the point that the editor made, we had a table in a supplement with that specification. Of course, by this time, I'm getting a little frustrated because this is not the first rejection I got. So I sent an email back to the editor saying, the specification you're asking about was in my supplement in my initial submission. Did you look at the supplement? If I moved it from the supplement to the main paper, would you review this paper? And there was no reply to that message. We did everything we could brainstorm in terms of econometrics, and we can't get rid of this result. And we provide all 30, 40 tables worth of results to the editors, and until recently, unable to get an editor to even look at the paper.
So what's the story with the papers? Is it going to be published? Has it been? Somebody finally pick it up?
So we're at what's called the revise and resubmit stage. So that means that we did get an editor to look at the paper, send it to referees, and get comments. The comments all came back favorable, but always some nitpicky stuff. A lot of it presentation, no econometric issues. And we're working on finishing those up right now. It might be worth pointing out, the co-author and I, we kind of gave up on the top tier journals and the general interest stuff. And so we sent it to the Journal of Private Enterprise, which is on the journal ranking, not nearly as high as the others, but it's a publication that specifically takes submissions from free market economists, publications that aren't necessarily interested in supporting government policies. So the good editors at the Journal of Private Enterprise are happy to take a look at this. And so it looks like we can satisfy these referees. We might be able to get it published there.
Brian, my next question was going to be, who's the hero that we should all be thanking for taking a serious look at a serious thing, right? I haven't read your paper yet. I don't know if you're a crazy person. Maybe you are. I don't know if you're right or not, but what I do know is that every single word out of your mouth is exactly the kind of thing that should be taken seriously by anybody who wants human life to be better.
Thank you. And we're using publicly available data. And the paper is black and white about the methods we're using. So anybody who's taken an econometrics class can reproduce our results. And of course, once we get the paper submitted, we'll share all the code and the data with everybody. So everything in the paper will be completely reproducible for anybody who wants to redo the work.
And we'd like to make it available to our listeners who typically don't read academic papers, but this is the sort of thing that I think a lot of them, having heard you talk about it, would really like to give it an honest read. They're generally well-educated non-experts, so a lot of it's going to fly right over your heads, and that's fine. These are papers written by specialists for specialists. But it might be really interesting for you to see what these things really look like. If you could maybe take 2 or 3 steps back and really reconsider everything that happened here, because this is really an interesting story. This is a very interesting story, and it touches on a lot of different things. When you look at your story here, what are your main takeaways? What are the things that horrify you? And there are a couple of things here that should horrify anybody. And what are the things that give you a moment, at least, of optimism?
Optimism is I got folks like you who will listen to the results and talk about them. And I hope that once we get it published, that other people will read and think, and maybe they'll find a flaw, maybe they'll find another application, maybe extend it to other policies. So I have hope. And I'm not the only guy. There is some research out there on different policies that were going on during COVID and trying to point out harmful effects. Maybe there's some incremental contribution here that other people might feel empowered to delve into other questions. I mean, you're talking about this kind of political popularity. If you did a similar project but talked about mental health problems, I think you would get a lot of support for that right now. It seems like mental health concerns coming out of COVID is a topic everybody's willing to talk about, maybe not face mask mandates. So hopefully we can kind of open up people's willingness to chat. On the horror side, even if you hadn't found the meta studies that way had been published by 2020, and we just took it as we know nothing about the face mask mandate. The fact that we're not willing to even really have a conversation about a policy that had never been tried before, and people willing to just shame others because of their behaviors, just quite unfortunate. I wish we could have the mentality that we're willing to experiment, we're willing to try policies, but we also should have academics rushing to measure the impact right away so that we can revise rather than just kind of presume the answers. Matter of fact, I'll tell you one last story on that one, on the horrifying one. One of the editors who desk rejected the paper actually said, why should I consider research on an untested theory? If it's untested, then isn't there value in having a test? But instead, it's like, no, clearly this is a crazy theory and it's got to be wrong. And so I don't want to publish any data that might be supporting a crazy theory.
Well, this has really been quite an eye-opener, Brian. Thanks for coming along. I'm happy to say that of the interviews we've done in the last year or so, this is right up there with my favorites.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.